Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on EU affairs. My name is Elena Balestra, and I'm Membership and Capacity Building Manager at EPF. Before we dive into today's topic, I would like to share with you a few housekeeping rules to make your webinar experience more enjoyable. You can see that you have a control panel at the right side of your screen. If you want to ask us a question or share a comment with us, you can type it in the question dedicated box. We will take all the questions at the end, and if you won't be able to answer to your question, we will get back to you later on via email. You still can send any question you might have during the session, so to keep the conversation going. Due to the large number of participants today, you are all in listen-only mode, so if you really want to communicate with us, please use the chat box. If you want to minimize the control panel to better see the screen and the slides that my colleague will propose you, please click on the orange arrow at the left of your panel. Of course, you will receive all the slides and the recording of this video after the webinar, which will be also available on EPF YouTube channel. Now that we took care of all the housekeeping rules, we can dive into today's topic, EU affairs. And to do so, we have our guest speaker, EPF Policy Officer Kostas Aligiannis, which is with us today. Kostas, welcome very much, and thank you for taking the time to explaining us the EU institution and the legislative process.
Thank you, Elena.
And Kostas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So welcome from me as well, everyone. I'm policy officer here at EPF, and we thought it's a nice idea to discuss a bit how the European Union works. And for this, there will be three main things that we will be looking at today. The main European institutions, how the legislative process works, so how legislation is made at European level, and what patient organizations can do in order to influence this legislative process. There will be some questions throughout the webinar, which will be popping up on your windows just to see if everyone is on the same page and if the messages that I was trying to communicate were clear. So before we're going to start with meeting the European institutions, I'll say 2 words about EPF. So we're an umbrella organization working at European level, meaning that we have 2 different types of members. We have national coalitions focusing on all sorts of diseases in their national context and in their specific country. And we have also disease-specific organizations working like EPF at European level, but representing only a specific disease. At the moment, we have 74 members. And here you can see our mission and vision. I will not spend too much time on this. You can find all the information about EPF on our website. So the first thing that is maybe important to clarify is that there are different structures at European level and international level, and different countries participate in all those different structures, and sometimes they're a bit confused with each other. So we have the European Union, the European Customs Union, we have EFTA, we have most of the countries on the European continent are also part of the UN. We have the Schengen area, we have the European Economic Area, and we also have NATO, the Eurozone. So those are all kinds of institutions that are linked in different ways and do not always the same countries are participating in them. We will focus only on the European Union today, but just to put it a bit in context, I thought it's interesting to see this slide. The European Union at the moment has 28 member states, the ones that you can see on this map. As of March next year, there will be one less. Great Britain is getting out of the EU. Following their own decision. And before we start talking about the separate European institutions, I thought it was interesting to have a bit of an idea of what the competences are of the European Union. So what can be done at European Union level as opposed to national level. Basically, the way that the EU works is that there are two main treaties, the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which together are the Lisbon Treaty that you might have heard about. And what is discussed in those treaties is the division of power between the different countries of the European Union, the member states, and the European Union itself. So in order not to have conflict of who regulates what, the treaty stipulates different competences in different policy areas. So for example, and those are really only random examples to give you a better understanding of what is meant by the competences. There is a full list in the articles that you can click on if you receive the presentation later. So an exclusive competence is something that can only be regulated at the European Union level, and the member states have given up this competence in order for it to be regulated from the EU, because that is more efficient in that way. So for example, monetary union, so everything that has to do with financial policies, not fiscal policies, but only financial policies, is an exclusive competence of the European Union. A shared competence is that of the internal market, and then very often we hear that health is not a competence of the European Union, but this is not completely true, because health is one of those policies that is where the European Union has the competence to support, coordinate, or supplement actions of the member states. So that means that they do have a much more limited competence than in other areas, but they still have a competence. And then the last one is the competence to provide arrangements within which EU member states must coordinate their policies, and that's, for example, the social policies. Now you will see with big letters Article 168 written there, and that is because in that article, health and what can be done at European level in the area of health is explained in much more detail than in this Article 6 that the slide is also referring to. That is because well, as you can see from the numbers as well, they're really the beginning of the treaty, so they just stipulate the different competences, and then later on in the treaty, every policy area is analyzed in more detail. This is a bit of a tryout, as it's the first question that we want to pose to you on this slide, so let's see if this works. Basically, our question is, which institution is hosted in this building? And normally you should be able now to see this question on your screen. So please select the answers that you think is correct. We'll give you a bit of time to do this. Okay, so I see that almost everyone has voted, so we close the voting now. 67% of you thought that the European Commission is hosted in this building, which is also the correct answer to the question. It is indeed the Parlement building and on the Schuman Square here in Brussels, where the Commission is hosted. Here you can see the College of Commissioners. So the Commission works a bit like the ministries at national level. You have every country has one commissioner, and each of them is responsible for different policy areas. So it works a bit like national governments in the sense that commissioners have different areas for which they are responsible for. And what exactly do they do? The Commission proposes legislation. So contrary to how it works at national level, where also the Parliament sometimes or parliamentarians can propose legislation, this is not the case for the European Commission or for the European Union. It's only the European Commission that can propose legislation. They also enforce legislation, which means that they can monitor if all the member states are implementing the European legislation correctly. What they cannot do is enforce European law on individual companies. So, for example, if a company based in one specific member state is not complying to European law, the only thing that can be done by the European Union is to bring the country to court in order to make this country take action against the company, but they would not be able to address the company themselves, except for very limited cases in very specific areas. The European Commission also sets the objectives and priorities for the year. There is the annual Commission working program. Usually there is a big working program in the beginning of the Commission, when after the elections, for the entirety of their mandate, and then on an annual basis we get smaller parts of that program of what's going to be happening that year. So this is something that organizations like EPF working at European level pay a lot of attention to, because it really highlights what we should be expecting in the next months. In that sense, the Commission also manages and implements EU policies, and also represents the European Union outside Europe, so it has representations in different countries around the world. How is the Commission structured? Here you can see a very long list of, as we call them, DGs, Directorate General. So as I said, those can be a bit paralleled to the national ministry. So you have different DGs working on different areas. We have DG Agri, so the Directorate General on Agricultural and Rural Development. And each of those DGs is responsible for a different areas, as you can see from the name. Now, as you might have seen, there are many more DGs than commissioners. That is because some of them belong to, or the head of the DGs is one commissioner. So, for example, the translation, the human resources, and the Secretary General are all belonging to the President of the Commission. So he's the head of all three departments. What is the most important department for us working in healthcare? That is DG Sante, so the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety. And here you can see a bit of its very complex structure. You have different directorates dealing with a variety of topics. Basically, you have 4 directorates dealing with food safety and 2 directorates dealing with health. And within those directorates, you have units dealing with more specific issues on these topics. The next institution that we will present is the European Parliament. And on this slide, we would also like to pose a question to you, and that is, which building, where is the building that you can see on this picture located? So I'll leave you some time to answer this question. So I see most of you have voted, and indeed the building that you could see on this picture was the European Parliament building in Strasbourg. There are different buildings of the European Parliament. One of them is in Strasbourg and one of them is in Brussels. This one is in Strasbourg, which is also the official seat of the European Parliament, where the plenary sittings take place once a month. This is a bit of a controversial issue, as you might have heard, but the majority of the work of the European Parliament takes place in this building in Brussels, where the committee meetings and all the other meetings take place. The members of the Parliament have offices in both buildings, but the majority of things happen in Brussels, with the exception of the plenaries. A fun fact for you, where the red arrow is our EPF offices, so we're located very closely to the European Parliament, which is very convenient for our work. So how is the parliament structured now? We saw how the commission is structured, but maybe it's also interesting to know a bit more about the parliament. We have different committees as in national parliaments on different topics. There are different nationalities, and the members of the parliament are elected in different countries. So they're elected by people from one specific country, and you can only vote for MEPs from the country that you vote in. And they're obviously divided by political party, as in all parliaments. We always say MEP for short. There are 751 MEPs coming from all the member states of the European Union, and depending on the population of the member state, there is a different number of MEPs allocated to each country. Now, if we have a look at the parties, also the parties, and based on the last elections, the division of seats between the parties. So you can see from the GUE party, which is the far left party, up until the extreme right party, the ENF. You have different parties with different sizes, and every national party belongs to one of those European umbrella coalitions of. So, for example, you would have the National Socialist Party belonging to the S&D party, etc. It is very often the case that at national level there are more than one parties belonging to the same European party, and there is, as you can see, 18 non-attached members. So that means that is 18 MEPs that decided that none of the European parties fits their ideology, so they didn't feel that they could join any of them. And here you have a few of the prominent MEPs that you might have seen or know about. Going on, as I said, the European Parliament is also divided in committees. So you have every MEP belongs to a different committee. Those committees are very important because they are the ones that are responsible for pieces of legislation that belongs to this area of policy. So if there is, for example, a legislation being discussed that has to do with employment, it would be the Employment and Social Affairs Committee that would have a much more extensive discussion of this legislation and would propose amendments. Obviously, the whole Parliament at the end votes on this as well, but the actual work where you can make changes to the legislation and propose amendments is really done within those committees, and it is the members of the Parliament after the elections that choose which committees they want to be in. Most of the MEPs also belong to a delegation. The delegations are less important for us as EPF, but more important for people working on external affairs or international politics. So basically it is MEPs that deal specifically with the relations of the European Union with a specific country or a number of countries or an international organization such as NATO. And then the last institution that is the main institution of the European Union is the Council. Now, what do we mean by the Council? We have the Council of the European Union, we have the Council of the European Council, and we have the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is not a institution of the European Union. It is the institution that has the court in Strasbourg, so the Court of Human Rights. And it does not link to the European Union as such, although all member states of the European Union are also obviously also members of the Council of Europe. As I said, we have the European Council and the Council of the European Union. The European Council, you might guess from this picture, is the council where all the prime ministers or heads of state from the different countries come together. So this is really a very high level organization. It's a structure of the European Union that decides the general political direction and the priorities of the European Union. And next to the heads of state, also it has a president of its own, which is President Tusk at the moment. and the President of the Commission is also present at the meetings of the European Council. The European Council does not negotiate or adopt EU law. This is done by the Council of the European Union. They just decide the policy agendas and the general directions in which we are going. This is not that to say that they're not important, just because they don't vote on law. They're actually really deciding on strategic decisions and how to go forward with the European Union, but they don't get into the details of different legislations. When we say the Council, we usually mean the Council of the European Union, and that is the institution where the governments are represented as well, but at minister level, not at prime minister or president level. So this is the institution where EU law is negotiated and adopted, where the policies are coordinated. It also has competences in the area of foreign affairs and security policy. It concludes international agreements, and it adopts the budget of the European Union. Obviously, it would be very complicated if all the ministers would have to come together from every country. So they are divided into different configurations, as they are called, depending on the topic that is discussed. Here you can see the list of configurations that exist, and depending on the topic that is, or depending on the legislation, the different configurations discuss it. So that means that if there is a legislation on environment, for example, it would be the configuration of environment discussing this, where all the ministers of environment or relating areas would come together at national level. Sometimes it happens that at the national level, because the ministers are defined, they have a different structure than the configurations of the council, you would have 1 or 2 or 3 ministers coming together for those meetings. Obviously, the ministers are very busy and they cannot prepare and draft all the legislation themselves. So every country has a permanent representation in Brussels, where people representing the government negotiate and agree on positions on the different legislations that are proposed by the Commission at a working level. So they go through all the details and the things that are easily agreed upon, so that the ministers, when they come together a few times a year, can only have to decide on the very political or controversial questions and the part of the legislation that that really no agreement could be found on at working party level. So having gone through the institutions very quickly, obviously not so much in detail, but I hope that this is a bit of a basic understanding of the 3 different institutions and how they're structured internally. Now, what is their role and why they're there for? It is to adopt legislation, and there's 3 different types of legislation. We have regulations, directive, and decisions. Decisions are something that we usually don't deal with that much, because they are addressed to one specific country or one specific company, even sometimes. Regulations and directives are really broad, general pieces of legislation that are binding for all the countries and citizens of the European Union. What is the difference is that regulation, from the moment that it is adopted, is applicable to all the countries and the citizens, while a directive is sets goals out that need to be achieved by the member states. So, for example, it is used very often in the area of consumer protection, where a minimum standard of consumer protection is guaranteed throughout the EU by this directive, but every country has the freedom to adopt legislation that goes further. So there is a minimum throughout the EU, but every country can make extra measures to protect their citizens in the way that they find appropriate. What is the process to adopt the legislation? This is a very simplified graph, and we will go a bit more detail in the next slides, but basically it's always the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council that play the main role in this. The Commission, as we said, is the initiator of the process. So after a public consultation where member state citizens, everyone who is interested in this particular piece of legislation is consulted, proposes a legislation on one specific topic that they have identified as important, and then sends this to the European Parliament, where one of the members of the Parliament, the rapporteur, is appointed in drafting an opinion or basically providing the input of the Parliament. So this means that they can actually change the wording of the legislation that is proposed by the Commission. They can add some things, they can delete some things, and they can adjust it to what they find important, depending on their political party, on the country that they come from, on the people that they were elected by, etc. At the same time, the Council, and I've put the Austrian flag because at the moment Austria has the presidency of the Council, does the same process in parallel, in the sense that all the representatives from the different countries here in Brussels discuss this legislation between themselves and try to find a common ground on what they agree on. Those processes happen in parallel, so the European Parliament works with all the MEPs from the specific committee, but also civil society and other stakeholders in order to come to a conclusion, and at the Council level they adopt their position in order to, in the end, start discussing and trying to find an agreement between them. There are different readings, meaning that if after the first time that the positions are adopted, they are so far apart that there cannot be an agreement, then there is a second try, taking into account each other's position to find something that would come to a result. Usually there are trilogue meetings in the end, which means that the European Commission, the Parliament and the Council all come together and they try to find a compromise on the final text of the legislation and how it should read. From the moment the Commission has proposed the legislation, it is actually not allowed to do much anymore. It obviously tries to influence the Parliament and the Council in the way that it wants, but this is really done informally and it doesn't have any formal role, except for the right to withdraw the proposal at any time. So if the Council and the Parliament are going to a legislation that is so fundamentally different from what they have proposed since the beginning, they have the right to just withdraw the proposal so that no agreement is made. If the European Parliament and the Council can agree on a final text, then the legislation is adopted. And then the process is final. And now the last part, which I'll try to do quickly so that you would have time to ask questions if needed, is what about patient organizations? What is the role of patient organizations and where do they fit into this process? In order to make it a bit more clear, it is good to remember that there are different types of patient organizations, national patient organizations and European level disease-specific organizations. And this is important because, as you will see in the next slides, there are different parts of the process that you can influence better depending on what type of organization you are. Influencing the legislation can be done at the level of all three institutions. You can influence the Commission, you can influence the Parliament, and you can influence the Council. And if you want to be successful in getting your points through, you have to deal with all three institutions at the same time. This might seem very tricky because you can only be at one place at one time, but the good thing is that the different institutions usually deal with this legislation at different points in time. So at the level of the Commission, what can you do? The easiest to influence the Commission is for European umbrella organizations because they are working at European level, so they can monitor the work of the Commission. They can see what proposals are coming up. They know the program of the Commission. They monitor the calls for proposals, so they're very well aware of anything that might come up at European level. You can respond to the public consultations preceding every legislation, where you can voice the concerns or the ideas of the people that you represent. But you can also raise awareness over things that are missing. This is what we call proactive advocacy. So you follow what is in the Commission work program, but you might see that there are things that are very important for you that are just not in there. And what do you do in that case? You try to make the Commission aware of the fact that they need to take action in this area, and you try to explain to them why they need to take action and how they need to take action, and hope that they will take this into account. When we're working with the Parliament, the things are a bit different. You have 751 MEPs divided in committees, nationality, and political party. So depending on what you want to achieve and who you are, you can tackle the MEPs depending on their different structures that they participate in. So as a European umbrella organization, we work with the MEPs mostly in the ENVI committee, so the Environmental Protection Committee that also deals with public health, because those are the MEPs that are interested in the area of health. So those are the people that we as an umbrella organization at European level can influence based on the fact that they are part of the ENVI committee. If you're a national patient organization, you can tackle MEPs based on their nationality, because you are the voters, you are the people who put them there, and you can demand things from them, you can ask them things, you can propose them things, and they are very much willing to listen to you because they also want to be re-elected, so they want to make their voters happy. Political party is something that we take into account, and this is something that every organization has their own way of dealing with. There's some more political organizations, some less political, so that is up to every organization to decide how they deal with the political parties. Now, when we say you can work with the Parliament, either with the ENVI committee or with MEPs from your nationality, what can you do? That is to send your positions. They're interested in receiving them, and they're interested in reading them because they deal with a lot of topics from many different, with many legislations on various things, and they cannot know the details of everything. So providing them with information is actually very useful for them, because then they can compare and they can make their mind on how they will vote and what they will vote on and what amendments they will propose, depending on the input that they get, because they cannot be experts on all the topics. If you want to go one step further, you can actually also propose amendments to them. So you can take the text that is proposed by the Commission and you can look at it, you can delete some parts of it, add some parts of it, change some words, come up with new ideas and things that are not in there, and then you can talk to MEPs and try to convince them that this should be in this legislation, and they have the power to propose it and to actually adopt it later into legislation. And it's very easy to meet them and discuss. It takes some effort to set up a meeting, but if you're representing an organization and you have something to say and you can show that you have expertise and that you are knowledgeable about a certain topic, they're usually happy to meet with you and discuss with you. And same as with the Commission, you can also make them aware of things that are missing. If there's something that you really want and there is no proposal by the Commission, there is no action on this area, you can ask them to make this message come across, because we can do everything we can from our side, from the civil society part. But if an MEP is proposing something, that is usually more powerful, and some people listen to it more than they listen to civil society. What they can also do is ask the Commission questions. If you think that the Commission is inactive, or there are things that they are not doing correctly, or that they're not taking action, or they're taking the wrong action, MEPs have the right to ask a question to the Commission, and the Commission is obliged to answer. So this happens very often, and you can propose those questions to MEPs. Then the last institution and how you can work with them is the European Council. At council level, obviously, the national patient organizations have a big advantage, because this is the institution that represents their governments and their country at the European Union level. So national patient organizations can influence the council much better, because they know the structure better, they know the position, they can change the position of the government, and they can have a much bigger influence than any European umbrella organization can have. What can you do? You can monitor what's happening at the EPSCO, so that is the council formation that deals with health. You can send them the position papers and you can send them amendments. This is not a duplication of work because you can just send them the same things that you send to the parliament. They will integrate it into their work. Maybe yes, maybe no, but you can always try. And the more information you provide, the easier you make their work and the more likely it is for them to take into account the things that you propose to them. Who can you target? You can target, obviously, the ministers or the ministry at national level in your own country, but you can also target the permanent representation in Brussels, because as I said, there is the people responsible at the permanent representations dealing with all the files and doing the negotiations, and they can actually influence the legislation as well. Obviously, they're always following guidelines from the ministry, but if it is small things that are not necessarily against the line of the government, you can propose extra ideas to them that they might not be opposed. The presidencies have a big influence. So if your country has the presidency of the European of the Council at that moment, you can they're much more active and you have many more opportunities to influence them. And they're also organizing events in their own country, so you can try to participate in those events in order to make your voice heard. So we said that the legislation is adopted. Is it then done? No. There is more that you can do once the legislation is adopted. If it's a regulation, then you can have your rights recognized. Just because the regulation is there doesn't mean it is done. Very often you still have to make some effort to have your rights recognized, and a big part of what is missing often in legislation that is decided at European Union level is that people don't know about it, and there is a lot of legislation that give you rights that you might not be aware of. So as a patient organization, you can let the patients that you work with know about their rights and inform them and let them use the rights that they have. If it is a directive that the member states still have to transpose into national law, what you can do is try to influence your country, your government, in order to take the legislation that is proposed by the European Union and adjust it in such a way so that it's even better for patients and for patient organizations. Yeah, so here you can see a bit of an overview of the different advantages that you have depending on whether you're an umbrella organization or a national organization. If you're working at European level, you're obviously closer to European decision makers and you should make use of this. You are in better place to monitor EU legislation, to work with the Parliament, with the Commission, with the institutions that are based here in Brussels, and you have a better overview of everything that is happening here in European level, and you can disseminate this to your national members. If you're a national organization and you're working at national level, you have a big advantage with the Council of the European Union, because they are the people from your country and they're much more likely to listen to a national organization than a European umbrella organization. You also have a greater influence on MEPs, even though most of them are traveling most of the time between Brussels and Strasbourg, and you might not always be in touch with them. They do go back to their countries from every few weeks, and they meet with the people in the country, and they're much more likely to listen to you as well, because you are the voters, you are the people that put them in their place, so they want to take into account your views. And you have a better overview of the national situation and the national legislation. And obviously, national organizations are much more closer to patients than at European level, because there is a layer in between. Before we close, one last thing. We talked a lot about the legislation, how it's adopted, and what happens when it is adopted, what happens when it's adopted and not implemented correctly, or not, or if countries go against the legislation anyway. Then we have the European Court of Justice. It consists of 28 judges, so one judge is from every country. The president at the moment is the Belgian judge, Elena, who was actually yesterday re-elected for another term of 2 years. And without going into too much detail, because it is a bit out of the scope of this webinar, but the two most important procedures are a preliminary ruling, which basically means that if there is any unclarity or dispute about the meaning of a legislation or the implications of a legislation, you can ask the court for its opinion on interpreting the law. And those cases are binding and should be followed. And you also have infringement procedures, which is when the Commission takes a country to the European Court because they're not implementing the legislation correctly. So we can now go to the questions. And just to see if everything was clear, we can, you will see the questions that you see right now on the slide. We will post them one by one, so please answer them depending on your knowledge or what you learned today. And afterwards, we will have the opportunity for questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, correct. So we're going to launch the third poll, so to see if you have been attentive enough to this webinar. So you can see now, can the European Commission vote on legislation? There are three options: yes, no, only in the area of fisheries. You have 30 seconds from now. So the correct answer is no, as 86% said correctly.
Exactly. So as we said before, the European Commission proposes legislation and can withdraw the legislation if the negotiations between the Parliament and the Council is not in line with what they were expecting. But indeed, they cannot vote on the legislation after they have proposed it. So
no one was strict about the fisheries, but the 14% that say yes, they will be able to revise this video and this presentation afterwards. Let's go for the next question. What does DG stand for? You have three options: Directive on Growth, Delegating Group, or Directorate General. 3 seconds from now. 30 seconds, sorry. So we can close the poll now. So very well, 96% of you say that it means Directorate General, which is a correct answer. The 4% say Delegating Group. Kostas, would you like to give? Well, there's not much to say.
There's not much to say, no.
Is the answer?
We made it up. I don't think it's, well, maybe it exists, but not.
Not in the Commission way of working, and we mainly work with DG Sante, correct? If you work on health issues, on public health. Okay, let's go for the next. So this is a question about the current European Parliament. What is currently the largest party represented in the European Parliament? ALDE, EPP, or SD? Very well, we close the vote. And correct. 83% of you say that it's currently EPT. And then we can share the results, the slide. And as you know,
we can go back to the slide.
We can go back. In the meantime, I can remind everyone that in May, next May, all European citizens will vote for the next European Parliament, and that EPF just yesterday launched a campaign for better health in Europe and to raise awareness about health issues. So if you want to look on our website, you will find some videos, and really is an invite to all European citizens to look or who is really among the future members of the European Parliament looking to create a better health in Europe. While you're looking through the programs, well, if you're interested in public health and it's something close to you as a patient or as a patient advocate, it's something that you might want to look into as well. Kostas, on the question.
And on the question, the European People's Party, so the Christian Democrats at the moment have 216 out of the 751 seats, and the second largest party is the S&D with 189 seats. ALDE is quite a bit smaller and only has 68 seats in the parliament. So
yeah,
I think we can go into the next question.
The last question, I will launch it. Does the European Council vote on legislation? Yes or no? People are changing their minds. Few more seconds to go. Make up your mind. And time is off.
So the correct answer is no. The European Council does not vote on legislation. The Council of the European Union votes on legislation. The European Council, as I said, is the council where the prime ministers or presidents of every country are represented, and they decide on the general political agenda of the EU. At ministerial level, so at the Council of the European Union, which we call the Council, the legislation is voted from the Council side, and the final position on those pieces of legislation are adopted.
But we admit that this is a tricky one.
That is a very tricky one, and I think there is a lot of people that work with institutions every day that confuse the European Council with the Council of the European Union.
So very, very well done to the small 36%.
Exactly.
Very well done. All right, we asked you a lot of questions. I think now is the time for them to ask us questions. So if you want to do so, you can use the chat box and the question box on the right side of your panel. And I already see some question coming. We have one from Maria from Spain. I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly, Maria. So you say that there are 3 types of legislations, Kostas, and how and who decides which one it will be?
Okay.
I think it refers to regulation or...
Yes. If that's the question about the regulation, and please correct us if we are not answering correctly. But if the question is indeed about the regulation, the directive, and the decision, that is, with the exception of the decision that is decided by the European Commission in order to address one specific country or one company. So it's in very specific cases, and when they really need to address a country on something in a specific context, it is up to the Commission to decide whether they want to propose a regulation or a directive. And this takes into account the competences that they have. So in areas where the European Union has an exclusive competence, they're much more likely to use a regulation because the member states don't have much of a say in what is going to be decided. While if we're talking about areas where there is a shared competence, a directive might be more appropriate. but at the same time, it really depends also on the nature of the topic and on what they want to be achieved, what needs to be achieved. Sometimes if there is a minimum harmonization, so as I said before, in consumer protection, you want to provide a minimum of protection in every country, while every country would be allowed to go further. This would be a directive. If you want to set a sort of maximum in order to make sure that all the companies can sell their goods in different countries, you would rather use a regulation. So it really depends on the nature of the topic and on the competences that the EU has. Do you have another question?
Yes, we have a question coming from Camilla. Thank you for asking us, Camilla. How is the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Parliament elected? Or if they are elected?
They are indeed elected, and that's a very good question, especially with elections coming up. Because it's a discussion that has been going on for quite some time now. Normally, every country proposes one commissioner, and then the portfolios are divided internally. And what happens is that all the commissioners have to appear in front of the parliament, who asks them questions. So after the elections, first all the members of the European Parliament are decided upon based on the results of the elections. The Parliament elects their own president, and then they accept or don't accept all the commissioners that have been proposed by the countries. I think there has only been one case where a commissioner that was proposed did not get the position of commissioner afterwards. And at the same time, we have the process that you might have heard about, that of the Spitzenkandidat, which basically means that it was the idea that came up during the last elections that the party that would get the most votes at the European Parliament level would also, the president of the Commission should be from the same party as that. So every person who is running for president of the European Commission can ask a party to endorse them as their Spitzenkandidat. It is not yet sure if this will be it is not yet sure if this will be the case for the next elections. But for example, if we look now, President Juncker is indeed, or used to be a politician for the European People's Party, and is also the president of the Commission at the time where this is the largest party in the EU. So it will remain to be seen whether this will be indeed the process, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. There's a person asking, I've heard rumors that DG Sante is going to be removed. Do you have any information on this?
Yes, we had heard those rumors as well, and this was also the basis of the big campaign that EPF participated in, the EU for Health campaign. At the moment, we're being reassured that this is not the case. Just as a reminder, as with the ministries at national level, every new commission has the right to structure their organization the way that they want to, which means that if the commission wants to create new DGs, merge some DGs, or structure it differently than it is at the moment, they have the right to do so. So most likely there will be, and there always are, quite some restructurings going on. Whether this means that Sante will disappear completely remains to be seen, although, as I said, from the institution side, we keep on hearing the message that this will not be the case. Just to remind that during the last commission, Sante was Sanco, so it was the Directorate for Health and Consumer Protection. when the new commission came, the consumer part of Sanco was moved to DG Justice. This didn't mean that consumer protection has disappeared from European level. This just means that it's a different DG, even though it's not really reflected in the name, that is dealing now with consumer protection. We don't know what the case will be for the case of health, but in general, the Commission retains the right to structure their services the way that they want to. So it will depend on the new College of Commissioners.
Thank you, Kostas. There's another question. Can no EU states have any role in the EU organizations? And what is the benefit of not EU states from EU organizations? I think there's a bit of delegations, maybe.
Yes, so it depends on the country, actually. There are different agreements that the EU has with different countries. Normally, a third country does not participate in the, well, no third country participate, and by third country we mean basically every country that is not part of the European Union participates in the decision-making process at European level. So none of the countries are have a seat in the parliament or can elect commissioners or anything like that. Obviously, there are very comprehensive trade agreements with countries such as Norway, Switzerland, but that does not mean that they participate in any way to the structure of the EU or the decision making. What they can do is, for example, unilaterally allow certain decisions that are being made at European level or European Union level to also be implemented in their country. There are countries that use the euro, for example, that are not part of the eurozone. Thinking, for example, of the Vatican, if I'm not mistaken. But the disadvantage in this case would be that if anything changes and if the legislation changes at European level, you don't have a right or a voting right to influence this process. So if all the other countries, you agree with something that is applicable in your country as well as a third country, and then the decision is made to change this, you don't have any say on the decision anymore. But obviously, depending on the sort of relations that you have with the EU, the position of Norway and of China are very different as into how much EU law is applicable to their country.
There is another question. Why is there no European Parliament committee solely dedicated to health? Not everything is health. Not everything in health is public health.
Yes, this is also part of the European Parliament decides their committees and sets the committees in the way that they want to. Normally, if a country or if a committee is made, that means that it needs to have enough topics to be able to address legislation quite substantially. So the way that the committees are structured take into account the competences of the European Union. So for example, we have a dedicated committee on budget because this is something that is discussed every year. So you need to have a dedicated committee that can take care of this thing. The Internal Market Committee, for example, consists of a bigger number of MEPs than other committees because it is one of the core elements of the European Union and it deals with a lot of issues. Health is much broader and not everything related to health is only decided by the ENVI committee. So for example, if you are dealing with research on health, it might be the research committee that is dealing with this. That is not to say that all the other committees don't have a say. It means that one committee takes the lead and other committees can write opinions and try to influence the work of this committee, or they can propose things as well. But then it is not every single MEP within the committee that influences it, but it is the committee as a whole that drafts one report and sends it to to the committee that is leading on this file. So there is always an interaction. But with regards to structure and why there is no specific committee on health, that is because the Parliament has decided so by itself, and it creates the structure that it wants to.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Our time is coming to an end. Thank you very much for joining us today to this webinar. I hope that you liked it and you had some fun with us, and you also learned something useful that you will be able to apply in your own work. I kindly remind you that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the EPF YouTube channel shortly. If you're not you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, please do so you will be updated on any new video and webinar we will publish. And of course, we're also present on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and you can always reach us also on our website. I thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to see you soon. Have a nice evening.